Empathy, in its purest form, is the nervous system's capacity to mirror the inner state of another. Yet within that biological mechanism lies a deeper psychological destiny, one that Carl Gustav Jung suspected was both the foundation of human connection and the root of human suffering. The empath, as we now describe this archetype, stands at the threshold between biology and myth. A consciousness tuned to the emotional frequencies of others, yet often estranged from its own center. Jung never used the modern term empath, but his writings on transference, projection, and the collective unconscious describe precisely the same dynamic. The porous psyche that absorbs the unintegrated material of others. In his clinical notes from Zurich, he often wrote of individuals who carry the affective burdens of the collective. These were patients who experienced reality not as a self-contained entity, but as a field of emotional resonances. They felt what others refused to feel. They embodied what others repressed. And in this absorption they began to fragment. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Empaths, in Jungian terms, are those who unconsciously take on the psychic contents of the collective shadow, the repressed, disowned emotions of their family, society, or intimate partners. Their gift is sensitivity. Their curse is identification. They do not merely perceive pain, they become it. What begins as heightened perception devolves over years of exposure into emotional colonization. Modern neuroscience gives language to what Jung intuited. The mirror neuron system, discovered in the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys and later identified in humans, is the biological substrate of empathy. These neural circuits fire not only when one performs an action, but also when one observes another performing it. They create an embodied simulation of another's state. For the empath, this system operates at an unusually high amplitude. Functional MRI studies of highly empathic individuals reveal hyperactivation in the anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with affective resonance and interoception. In simple terms, empaths feel others' feelings in their own body. This neural openness is double-edged. It forms the basis of compassion, but when unregulated by prefrontal control, the region responsible for emotional boundaries and self-other differentiation, it becomes a form of neurological overexposure. What Jung would have called possession by archetypal material now finds its mirror in neuroscience, limbic hijacking by unfiltered emotional data. You think you're helping because you can feel them. But feeling without discernment is not empathy, it's contagion. Clinically, empathy often originates not in abundance but in adaptation. Children raised in volatile or emotionally inconsistent environments develop hypervigilance as a survival mechanism. Their nervous system learns to scan for shifts in mood, tone, and expression, microsignals that predict safety or danger. Over time, this vigilance crystallizes into intuitive intelligence. What begins as fear-based perception becomes pattern recognition. In Jungian terms, this is the formation of the empathic archetype through the wound of abandonment. The child internalizes the affective chaos of the environment, becoming a psychic regulator for the family system. The result is a false self organized around attunement to others rather than authenticity. Winnicott would later call this the compliant self. Jung would have recognized it as a premature identification with the parent's unconscious. Thus, the empath is not born, but trained, forged in an atmosphere of emotional volatility where reading others accurately was the only form of safety. The tragedy is that what once protected them becomes the mechanism of self-erasure in adulthood. They continue to anticipate needs, regulate tensions, and absorb unspoken pain, now in romantic partners, workplaces, or friendships, until their psyche reaches saturation. Jung believed that every psychic system seeks equilibrium. When a function is overdeveloped, its opposite begins to press for recognition. In empaths, this manifests as a gradual intrusion of repressed anger, exhaustion, and alienation. The individual who once defined themselves by care begins to feel an unnameable resentment toward those they serve. At first, this is dismissed as fatigue or burnout, but beneath it lies something deeper, the shadow of the empath, the unacknowledged will to power. Jung observed that those who identify too strongly with goodness inevitably project their aggression outward. The empath represses their own dark instincts, anger, judgment, self-interest, in the name of love, and thus becomes psychologically split. The more they strive to be pure, the more their unconscious fills with rage. The body becomes the first battlefield. Chronic tension in the shoulders, migraines, irritable bowel syndromes, and unexplained fatigue are somatic expressions of emotional over-identification. The autonomic nervous system, constantly tuned to external cues, never downshifts into parasympathetic rest. Cortisol levels remain elevated. The vagus nerve, the great regulator of calm and connection, loses its tone. Neuroscience confirms what Jung foresaw. The psyche that absorbs too much of others' suffering begins to somatize it. Your exhaustion isn't weakness, it's data. It's your body telling you that you've mistaken absorption for compassion. At the psychological level, the empath's fall is the gradual erosion of the boundary between self and other. In Jungian theory, the boundary is not merely emotional but symbolic, the ego's protective membrane against the unconscious. When that membrane weakens, the individual becomes susceptible to possession by collective contents. In therapy, Jung witnessed patients who mirrored the moods of others so completely that their own identity became fluid. He noted that they oscillated between roles, adopting the psychic coloration of the moment. Today, we might describe this as codependency or emotional fusion, but in Jung's language it was a failure of individuation, the process of becoming a distinct, integrated self. Empaths often confuse empathy with love, but love presupposes differentiation. One cannot truly love what one has not first recognized as another. The empath's compulsion to merge is therefore not intimacy, but regression, a longing to return to the pre-conscious unity of childhood before boundaries and betrayals. It is a spiritualized form of dependency. If you feel empty when they pull away, it wasn't love, it was identification. The rescuer is the archetypal mask the empath wears to conceal their shadow. It is the persona of goodness that hides the unconscious need for control. To rescue is to ensure dependency, to help is to maintain superiority. Jung warned that the desire to save others often disguises the inability to face one's own darkness. Clinically, rescuers are magnetically drawn to those who confirm their role: addicts, narcissists, and wounded partners. The dynamic is mutually parasitic. One needs to be needed, the other needs to be enabled. Beneath the surface lies an unspoken contract. I will absorb your pain so I never have to face my own. This is why empaths often find themselves in cycles of emotional exploitation. Their compassion becomes a currency that others spend freely. In absorbing another's chaos, they avoid the terror of their own emptiness. But the psyche, intolerant of imbalance, eventually revolts. Jung described individuation as the moment when the unconscious demands to be lived. For the empath, this takes the form of collapse, a breakdown that is, paradoxically, a breakthrough. the system can no longer sustain its borrowed identities. Emotional repression gives way to raw affect, anger, grief, disillusionment. Neuroscience records this transition as a shift in neural dominance, from right hemisphere emotional absorption to bilateral integration. As trauma is processed, the prefrontal cortex begins to regulate the limbic system. Clarity replaces confusion. Subjectively, this feels like waking from a trance. The empath realizes that what they called compassion was often self-abandonment. It is at this threshold that the empath either descends into depression or begins the path of shadow integration, the reclamation of all that was disowned in the name of virtue. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, allowing both the capacity to love and the capacity to refuse, to nurture and to confront, to feel and to think. This transition terrifies the ego because it dismantles the moral identity that once guaranteed belonging. To reclaim one's aggression, intuition, and discernment is to risk rejection by those who depended on one's compliance. The empath's awakening is therefore always accompanied by social death. Micro-reflection. When you stop absorbing, they call you cold. But what they really mean is, you've stopped being useful to their unconscious. Every archetypal process finds its echo in myth. The empath's descent mirrors the myth of Inanna, the goddess who descends into the underworld, stripped of her adornments at each gate until she stands naked before the Queen of Death. In Jungian interpretation, this is the ego's descent into the unconscious, the necessary confrontation with what was denied. For the empath, the adornments are moral: kindness, patience, selflessness. Each must be surrendered to encounter the raw core of instinct. Only by descending into that darkness can they reclaim sovereignty over their own energy. In mythic terms, this is the death of the rescuer and the birth of the sovereign. At the nadir of this descent lies the possibility of transformation, not into hardness, but into integration. The empath who survives the collapse of borrowed identities emerges with a new nervous system, a recalibrated perception, and a consciousness no longer defined by reaction, but by choice. In the next section, the analysis turns to the process Jung identified as shadow integration, the synthesis of empathy and intellect, intuition and structure, and how modern neuroscience confirms the physiological reality of this transformation. Where Part 1 explored the empath's fall, Part 2 will examine their rebirth, the emergence of the awakened empath, a consciousness capable of feeling everything without being destroyed by it. Micro-reflection. The point was never to stop feeling. It was to learn whose pain belongs to you. Jung conceived individuation as the psyche's drive toward wholeness, the alignment of conscious and unconscious, contents under a single governing principle, the self. Modern neuroscience describes a parallel process in the body, top-down and bottom-up integration between cortical control and limbic emotion. During chronic over-empathy, the amygdala operates in hyper-vigilant mode, continuously signaling threat through cortisol and adrenaline. The ventral vagus complex, which mediates social engagement and calm connection, becomes undertoned. The empath lives in perpetual sympathetic activation, always alert to others' needs, seldom grounded in their own physiology. When the clarity event occurs, when recognition pierces denial, the prefrontal cortex re-engages. Functional connectivity between the prefrontal and limbic regions strengthens, and interoception, awareness of internal states, increases through the insula. The body begins to distinguish my feeling from your feeling. What Jung called differentiation of the opposites is mirrored in neurobiology as resynchronization between emotional and regulatory circuits. The moment you name what you feel, the limbic storm slows. Language is prefrontal electricity. This physiological coherence produces a psychological one: compassion tempered by discernment, emotional resonance anchored by cognitive structure. Empathy ceases to be absorption, it becomes informed perception. In Jungian theory, the shadow comprises all traits the ego rejects to preserve its chosen identity. For empaths, that identity is the good one: kind, patient, forgiving. Their shadow therefore contains the opposite qualities: anger, assertiveness, and a capacity for detachment. Integration begins when these disowned effects are no longer projected onto others. The empath who once attracted aggressors realizes that the outer tyrant mirrors the inner, unclaimed strength. Anger, when owned consciously, transforms from contagion to clarity. It signals boundary violation. Aggression, properly metabolized, becomes drive. Neuroimaging corroborates this shift. When individuals consciously label an emotion, "This is anger," activity decreases in the amygdala and increases in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Awareness itself regulates reactivity. Jung intuited this a century earlier. What is unconscious becomes fate. What is conscious becomes choice. Shadow integration, therefore, is not mystical union with darkness, but the cognitive ownership of instinct. The empath learns to deploy rather than deny the energies of survival, to channel rather than suppress them. You are not losing your light, you are switching on the rest of the spectrum. The newly integrated empath discovers a paradox. Emotional clarity confers influence. To perceive motives and subtext with precision is to hold leverage in every human interaction. Jung warned that such knowledge, untempered by morality, risks inflation, identification with the archetype of the magician or prophet. Modern psychology recognizes the same danger in the concept of empathic manipulation. The neural circuitry of empathy overlaps with that of social prediction. The ability to feel others also enables the ability to steer them. Without ethical orientation, sensitivity mutates into strategy. Hence Jung's insistence on individuation as a moral as well as psychological task. The self, as he defined it, is not egoic omnipotence, but a regulative center that harmonizes opposites. Power integrated through the self manifests as authenticity rather than control. In neurobiological terms, this corresponds to prefrontal limbic balance, neither suppression nor flooding. When empathy serves truth, it heals. When it serves ego, it manipulates. Post-integration, empathy becomes selective, a calibrated function rather than a constant broadcast. This is not numbness, but modulation. The individual discerns context. Who earns full resonance? Who requires measured distance? Physiologically, this reflects a healthy oscillation between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic system. Emotion is engaged, then released. The empath's body no longer remains in the pain of every story encountered. Psychologically, selective empathy manifests as boundaried compassion. One can witness suffering without merging with it. The awakened empath can sit beside another's despair and still hear their own pulse. This capacity redefines intimacy. Relationships cease to be mergers of wounds and become dialogues between differentiated psyches. Jung called this the coniunctio oppositorum, the sacred union of distinct wholes. Feeling everything doesn't mean carrying everything. The transformation of one empath rarely occurs in isolation. Systems organized around their compliance experience destabilization. Families lose their emotional regulator. Workplaces lose the uncomplaining stabilizer. Resistance follows. Others label the new boundaries as selfishness or coldness because they reveal the extent of prior dependence. Yet, paradoxically, the system's health improves over time. Without an automatic absorber, each member must confront their own disowned effect. Jung would interpret this as the collective shadow emerging into consciousness. On a societal scale, the same dynamic applies. When individuals stop outsourcing empathy to a few caretakers, responsibility diffuses. Modern organizational psychology notes similar effects. Teams with clearly bounded, self-regulated members show higher resilience than those with a single emotional caretaker. Empathy distributed consciously, not concentrated unconsciously, becomes sustainable culture. Your boundary is not the end of love, it is the beginning of mutual accountability. Jung distinguished between feeling and thinking as separate functions of consciousness. In the empath's evolution, these functions eventually converge into what contemporary researchers term emotional intelligence, the integration of affective data into rational decision-making. Neuroscience identifies this as the cooperation of limbic structures, emotion, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, executive reasoning. The result is neither cold logic nor sentimental chaos, but metacognition about emotion, awareness of what one feels and why. This synthesis creates what Jung envisioned as the mature personality, capable of compassion without illusion, of logic without cruelty. It marks the completion of the individuation spiral, feeling and thinking no longer enemies but dialectical partners. Wisdom begins when emotion and reason stop competing and start conversing. The ultimate sign of awakening is the emergence of the observer consciousness, the ability to witness one's internal states without immediate identification. Mindfulness research describes this as metacognitive awareness. Jung described it phenomenologically as the standpoint of the self. In neuro terms, this corresponds to increased activation in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate, regions of the default mode network associated with self-referential processing. Under training, these regions exhibit reduced coupling with limbic reactivity, producing calm observation rather than impulsive fusion. The empath thus transitions from empathic participant to empathic witness. They still perceive others' emotions vividly, but maintain a stable axis of awareness. This internal stillness radiates outward as authority. People sense it immediately. It is the calm that replaces explanation. Presence is the final language. Explanation belongs to those still seeking permission. Jung speculated that psychic evolution mirrors biological evolution, that consciousness adapts to environmental pressures. Empaths, seen through this lens, are not anomalies but forerunners of integration. Their nervous systems experiment with expanded interconnection, testing the species' capacity for collective awareness. However, evolution proceeds through selection, not sentimentality. Sensitivity without regulation is maladaptive. It consumes its host. Only when empathy learns boundary, when mirror neurons meet prefrontal discernment, does the trait become sustainable. The awakened empath represents that synthesis, the next iteration of social intelligence capable of cooperation without enmeshment. Modern social neuroscience supports this trajectory. Studies on compassion training show that regulated empathy increases pro-social behavior while decreasing empathic distress. In short, awareness plus boundary equals resilience. Jung's individuation and contemporary neuroplasticity describe the same law. Integration precedes expansion. The future of humanity depends on feeling together, without collapsing together. Every elevation of awareness demands a sacrifice. the empath's awakening costs the very identity that once guaranteed belonging. Jung wrote that the price of individuation is loneliness, the loss of collective innocence. The integrated empath cannot unsee manipulation or participate in unconscious games. Their empathy becomes incompatible with false harmony. This solitude, however, is fertile. In the quiet after disillusionment, creativity emerges. Many artists, therapists, and reformers are post-collapse empaths who have converted sensitivity into insight. The same mirror that once reflected others' pain now reflects patterns of humanity itself. Neurobiologically, this creative transcendence coincides with theta-gamma coupling, synchronous oscillations linking deep emotional states with higher cognitive processing. It is the brain's way of turning pain into pattern, chaos into meaning. Jung called it transcendent function, the psyche's alchemical power to reconcile opposites through symbolic imagination. Meaning is pain metabolized. Integration is not a permanent state. It requires maintenance. Even awakened empaths risk relapse into overabsorption under chronic stress. Regular restoration of vagal tone through breath, movement, and solitude is essential. In Jungian language, this is return to the self, periodic withdrawal into inner stillness to recenter consciousness. The modern world, saturated with digital emotion, makes this discipline urgent. Continuous exposure to mediated suffering reactivates the empathic circuitry without relational reciprocity, producing collective fatigue. Only deliberate rhythm, contact followed by containment, keeps empathy sustainable. To feel the world wisely, you must sometimes stop touching it. For clinicians, recognizing the empath's structure alters treatment strategy. Traditional catharsis, encouraging emotional release, often deepens fusion. The therapeutic task is differentiation, not discharge, strengthening ego boundaries, fostering self-referential awareness, and teaching physiological down-regulation. Interventions that integrate somatic tracking, awareness of bodily cues, cognitive reframing, and shadow dialogue prove most effective. The goal is to convert involuntary resonance into voluntary empathy. Jung's method of active imagination anticipated this by decades, bringing unconscious images into dialogue with the ego to achieve integration. For the awakened empath, therapy becomes mentorship in sovereignty, the art of remaining open without being penetrated by every psychic current. Jung often implied that the universe itself is relational, that psyche and world mirror each other. Empathy, then, is not merely a social faculty, but a metaphysical one, the mind's participation in a shared field of meaning. The awakened empath experiences this directly. When boundaries are clear yet permeable, perception extends beyond the personal into what Jung termed the collective unconscious, the symbolic network connecting all beings. In this sense, empathy perfected is not self-erasure, but reciprocity, the continuous exchange of awareness between individual and totality. Neuroscience names this coherence. Mysticism calls it unity. Jung saw it as the destiny of individuation, the reconciliation of the human and the cosmic. Empathy is not feeling another's pain. It is recognizing that the same life moves through both. The empath's journey, when traced through both Jungian psychology and modern science, follows a precise geometry. Fusion, the childhood adaptation of over-attunement. Fragmentation, the adult crisis of burnout and identity loss. Differentiation, the clarity event that restores boundary. Integration, the union of shadow and self-awareness. Reciprocity, the mature empathy that perceives without absorbing. Each stage is a neural reconfiguration and a symbolic initiation. The awakened empath emerges not as a saint, but as a sovereign, a being who feels deeply and chooses deliberately. Jung would recognize in them the living image of individuation itself, the psyche that has walked through identification, shadow, and solitude to arrive at freedom. To feel everything and remain whole, that is the rarest form of intelligence.